Good morning. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is Danielle Solomon, and I'm the Director of Progress 2050. We are a team that's dedicated to ensuring that the policies put forward are actually being responsive to the growing majority of Americans in this country. So today's discussion will focus on high-achieving students of color. Students of color are an increasing share of the overall student population. Despite their growing prominence in schools, research shows that they have less access to rigorous programming. This failure to engage our students, the most bright and talented ones, not only impacts the student themselves, but our nation at large. Today's conversation is aimed at not only raising awareness to this issue, but also to discuss policy solutions to ensure students of color have the opportunity to succeed and the tools they need to do so. I have yet to meet a young child who likes to be bored. I think when given the opportunity, they want to learn and be challenged. They are curious by nature. And we know that access to challenging and rigorous curriculum and instruction is an important gateway to post-secondary education and future career opportunities. Therefore, I think it's our duty to ensure that all children have the opportunity to be challenged and learn, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their gender, sexual orientation, disability, zip code, or language skills. So, with that, it is my pleasure to introduce a champion for all students, Congressman Grijalva. The Congressman began his career in public service as a community organizer in Tucson. 4 decades later, he continues to be an advocate in Congress. Before being elected, in 2002, he served on the Tucson Unified School District Governing Board and Pima County Board of Supervisors. He has long championed better policies for students, like an overall increase in education funding, closing achievement gaps, and specifically increasing funding for English language learners. Representative Grijalva is a ranking member of the House Natural Resources Committee. He serves on the Committee on Education and the Workforce. He's co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and is a long-standing member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. All Americans are lucky to have such a champion in Congress, and we are honored to have him here today. Congressman?
Very much. Thank you a lot for a kind introduction. And I was telling Norma and Jose that came with me from my office that I was a little intimidated because, I read the studies that come out of here, and then one always feels like whatever I say is not sufficient to some extent. But thank you. This opportunity to discuss how public schools can better support gifted and talented students of color. It's an interesting question, having served on a school board for 12 years back home. A school board from 1974 to 1986. An interesting time for public education. We were under a desegregation order. We were implementing Title IX. We were implementing IDEA. We were implementing affirmative action programs for faculty and staff in the district, inaugurating bilingual education in the district. Had the first teacher strike and the first teacher contract. Kind of went along, and working on underperforming schools. We called them various names during those times: focus schools, target schools. And at the time, the district was the largest in the state of Arizona, over 75,000 students. And now, this year, it's a little bit under 49,000. When I was on that school board, it was about 28% Latino, 8% African American, 5% Native American, and other students of color made up about 3-4%. This year, it's 65% Latino, 10% African American, 8% Native American, and 5% of students of color. I mention that because this is almost very reflective of what's going on in this nation, a majority minority district, and more of an urban American, exactly that. And you mentioned the demographic shift. 26 million plus students in our public education are of color. Almost 8 million African Americans, over 13 million Latino, almost 3 million Asian Pacific Islander, and other students of color. So, so this is a reality. It's a demographic shift. And, in Arizona, it's 45% of all the students in public schools are Latino, 43% in high school, and over 54% in preschool, in those public schools. It's a demographic shift that is happening in this country, and I think that reality, we haven't quite caught up with it. And certainly in the issue of gifted and talented students lagging further behind in being able to catch up and to be fully integrated in what can be offered in a curriculum and the kind of rigorous instruction and preparation that these students can receive. And so my point is, we shouldn't make assumptions about increasing the numbers of these groups of students by regulating the discussion to subgroups. The subgroup is the group. And I think policy and strategy has to encompass this demographic, or we're still dealing with afterthoughts and not quite the emphasis that we should be. So the subgroup thinking should go out the window, and it should be group. This is a group that we have to deal with. And to limit, and not to limit our strategy simply to the curricular changes that need to occur. That's important and vital. But we need to also address resource. We need to address classroom teacher quality and the support that the classroom teacher receives. We have to deal with and factor poverty and family dysfunction, part and parcel, how a student achieves and how a student feels a sense of satisfaction with their environment in the school. And doing those things are difficult, particularly on the resource side. And I also wanted to mention, everybody loves diversity. We embrace diversity. We talk about it. We talk about how important diversity is in this country and why it's a pillar of our society. And so we all embrace diversity. I think we've kind of reached in this era, I think it's not just about a warm hug for diversity, but how do you make it work? How do you make diversity work in our public schools? Because I'm a product of those schools, and to me, we're missing an opportunity here in this society as we make this demographic in the faces of Americans begin to change more and more. For me, the public school system is probably the greatest integrative tool in our society that we have. From many, there is one. Well, the schools are that laboratory. The schools are the ones that teach, and you learn about values, and you learn what it means to be an American. You learn those instinctive things that can only be part of an integrative effect that you're having around education. And so for that alone, and for the well-being of our society in the long run, the resources that are needed in our public schools should be a priority, not an afterthought, not something that you divert money for another purpose. And the challenge is English learners, immigrant children, the persistent issue of poverty, discrimination, and the need for robust civil rights, equal access, enforcement, capability, and willingness, and investigative capability and willingness on part of the federal government. And to look at discipline in our schools and how that affects and does not affect children. It's a structural issue, but it's also an issue that deals with what you're going to talk about today, equal access to that high-quality education, gifted and talented in particular, being the goal. And equal access needs to be the goal. It is the goal. But equal access in and of itself, without factoring in the very important part of equal access, which is equity, becomes just a hollow statement. We all want that to happen, but they're reaching equity so that it can happen and can function and can be integrated into our public school system is vital. And without it, we're going to be talking about this 10 years from now. So equity needs more resources for it to work. You can't starve a school system, and you can't starve schools. I find it so ironic that at a time when there is this demographic shift going on, and I'll only speak about my state, which is third lowest in per pupil allocation, and I told you some of the percentages as this changes. How in the world are we going to talk about economic security, the security of the social security that we need in terms of our communities and our society, about the social fabric of this country, if we're not putting resources into the schools and allowing the new faces of America to be fully educated, to have the opportunity, to have the rigorous academic challenges that are required, and in the process, allow those children to blossom. And resources to me are key. You got to address the greatest need. We know that 15% of our high schools produce 60% of our dropouts. I'm not a statistician. I don't target stuff like that, but that seems pretty obvious to me, that where you have the greatest need in a feeder system in our public schools, that greatest need needs to be addressed. And it has to be addressed by making sure that that we have the kind of funding and resources for the infrastructure of a school, the facility, the technology, and the compensation for the people that work in those classrooms, and whom we always say the most important person is that teacher in that classroom. So there has to be a corresponding attention and compensation to that. And the persistent problems of poverty, resegregation, and economic and racial segregation in our country. Persistent. And not to understand that this is a contributing factor to how our children walk into our schools is I think it's a wrong way to approach children, those communities. Realizing that economic segregation is there, realizing that to some extent racial resegregation has happened, particularly in urban America, that we address that issue forthright and strongly by making sure that not only the resources but the partnerships that are necessary to make our schools better, by realizing that we're looking at a holistic issue that involves family, lack of structure, and beginning to understand that as we put resources into this investment of ours, our public schools, that there's going to be a huge dividend at the end. And there's a huge role for the federal government. The federal government, for a lot of children, is a legal guardian of last resort. To protect their rights, protect their equal access, and make sure that schools are not discriminating, that schools are not isolating, and that schools are not neglecting. That is a function as the legal guardian of last resort for the federal government for these babies. And step up on the issue of resources and supplement our public school systems across the country with the resources that might be needed. And like I said earlier, the legal enforcement and protection that are required. The shift of public resources to for-profit private schools, charter schools, even public charters, drain talent, and the resources get shifted. Even in the legislation that we've passed, we've set, precedents have been set about using some of that federal money directly by the states into putting in for-profit schools. Now, I don't have a problem with people making the decision that's what they want, fine. But I think that what they want should not be something that the kids in those neighborhoods and those schools have to subsidize for them. It should be, we should have the resources in our public schools. And the issue for me is accountability. public school systems are accountable for all those things I talked about when I first got on the school board. And we should be. Yet, we don't have the same level of the criteria or level of accountability applied to these other schools. How much are your people being paid? Are you dealing with kids with disability? How are you dealing with English learners? How much money do you spend per student? I think there's a disclosure issue. I have a piece of legislation that says, and I'm not shutting down for-profit schools. I'm just saying, if you are taking public money, you must be under the same rules that a public school system is under, and disclose and be transparent, and then let choice really come into a factor. And the very tangible intangibles, I mentioned them. Family and community support, the partnerships, the expectations. You know, we all have teachers that I remember Mrs. Rife, fifth grade teacher. I was having problems with retention, or maybe comprehension as well, but I was having trouble. And Mrs. Rife, fifth grade teacher, older white lady, said, you know, you're not dumb, Raul, you're just lazy. And so she spent a lot of time, even came to my house. I think she liked my mom's cooking, but that was beside the point. And worked on my English, worked on my study habits, and I always remember her, you know. And when I got elected to the school board, you know, I was a vanguard for the revolution we were going to have in that school district. And so I was always on TV screaming at my colleagues and the superintendent because they weren't doing the right thing. And she called me to go have pie. And when your fifth grade teacher calls you, you go have pie. And there you're sitting, you're in fifth grade again. And she goes, I'm so proud of you, dear. You're doing such a great job. And I always remember what she told me, and I kind of try to keep it. You said, you know, dear, but you don't have to be shrill to be heard. Well, I said, well, it's pretty good. And I changed my shrillness just to a constant hum, so I drove people crazy anyway. But anyway, site administrators, key, quality classroom teachers. And when I say diversity in the teachers, not just racial, it's in terms of experience. I think it's very important that be out there. And another factor I think that helps us not only identify gifted and talent, but give them the opportunities is the issue of students need to understand who they are. As much as part of the American fabric as anybody else. And I think identity and an understanding of who they are and how they fit into this great fabric of ours in this country, this mosaic, is very important. Kids with the confidence of self, the confidence of where they come from, the richness of their history, the contributions that they've made, builds their expectations and builds their confidence and their identity. I think identity is an important issue. It is not to separate or segregate, but it is to reinforce and provide some strength for the child to be confident and feel that they are truly part of this process. The rigorous academic programs in the schools need to be accessible to all students. We need to ensure that our local schools expand their partnerships. And we need to make sure that the colleges of education and our four-year institutions are teaching to the reality of now and not to the reality of Donna Reed and that TV show, or the reality of the 60s, or reality of the 70s, or the 80s. They were indeed teaching to the reality and the different faces that they're going to see in their classroom. And I think there's a huge responsibility in the colleges of education across this country to prepare good teachers that chose that as their vocation, and prepare those teachers for reality, and prepare those teachers for the students they will have in their classrooms and not for the ones perhaps they hope they will have. And I really still believe that is a huge part of it. The legislation we're working on is a resource-based one. The legislation we're working on is pre-K issues for children, because I think you need to seed these babies early. A holistic thing, a literacy program for parents, so they're part of it. These are all pieces of legislation, and a particular interest in middle schools that I have and that my staff has. Kind of like a little forgotten era in the middle of everything. And a forgotten piece of public education that all the indicators about failure and success are pretty obvious at that level. And I think a lot of work in that particular part of public education is important. I'm a public school advocate. I try to, perhaps, the discussion today is resource-based because I think it's really part of it. Because my experience with public education and with education in general is that we're idea rich and cash poor. And I think the fight over this next decade and the next 4 or 5 years is not so much about reinventing anything that we're doing, but it's going to be about resources, it's going to be about best practices, and it's going to be about providing for the public education system in our country the rudimentary resources to do the job that we all expect, and when they don't, we all criticize them for. And then there's real accountability. I have a school in my neighborhood, C. Rose, underperforming, failing. 8 years ago, there wasn't a philosophical change at the school. It was an attitude change at the school. There was additional resources provided to that school. And that school, every year for the last 4 years, ranks as one of the top schools, not only in Arizona, but across the country. Those babies do well, and they're the same babies from the same neighborhood that were there 8 years before that success. So there are best practices, and the potential and the intellect of these children is as strong and as viable as the intellect and strength of any child. And it's our responsibility for those that have the gift, for those that have exceeding talent, to nurture that. That is not just the cusp of many issues, but I think that they begin to provide for other students a set of expectations and goals that unfortunately we don't see enough of in our schools. So thank you very much. It's a little bit meandering because there was so much to say, but I think the panel is a very strong panel and the discussion is going to be very good. But I watched the debate last night, and if you ever wanted a stark definition of talented and non-talented, that was a debate to watch. And I think that the policies for the federal government, we've been retreating from education. We've been talking about competition, market-driven education initiatives. I think we need to go back to some very, very fundamental basics. Resources, teacher preparation, equal access, tied to the definition of equity as it applies to education, and I think we can make some progress. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, that was a lot to take in. Very good comments, and I'm going to get back to those. But first, let me introduce our distinguished panel in no particular order. It's my pleasure to introduce Lauren Mims, the Assistant Director for the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. The office works to identify practices to improve the achievement of African American students across the country. Michael Petrelli is the president of the Thomas Fordham Institute. They are committed to improving our educational system through research and analysis. Craig Robinson is the National Director of KIP Through College. It's a program aimed at closing the opportunity gap between students from high and low income communities. And last but not least, we have Hannah Dorello, who is a Posse Scholar and also a fellow at the Institute for the Recruitment of Teachers. The Institute works to ensure students of color have the tools they need to succeed, and they are also dedicated into ensuring teacher diversity. So let's get started. So I think what would be most helpful is if we kind of frame the conversation around the history behind gifted and talented. Why did we have gifted and talented created?
Well, first of all, I'm glad the Congressman brought up last night, because let's just kind of break the ice about that, right? I was expecting to come over here to the Center for American Progress. I'm thinking maybe the victory party is in another room. I don't know, but I thought people would be doing cartwheels and things. No, I know. Okay, yes, and nonpartisan. I do think I will be making some arguments today from, let's say, the center right. I just want to put out there that I have for a long time been a never Trump Republican, and I think last night demonstrated many reasons why. But I also want to say thank you to the Center for American Progress for having this panel. You know, unfortunately, this issue around gifted and talented, around how we can better serve our high achievers, for a long time, this has been one of those debates that's been really quite ideological. And I think this is a great sign that such a strong organization on the left is taking up this issue, that finally we might be able to get past that. And I think there's a reason for that ideology, and I'll get into that a little bit with the history. So, you know, the gifted and talented field has been around for about 100 years. It was back in the 1920s when some scholars started looking at this question. And a lot of this is just basic common sense, that, you know, kids would come to school, to elementary school, and there were some kids who were remarkably precocious, you know, maybe across the board or in a particular subject or with particular strengths. And the question that educators had to figure out was, oh my God, what are we going to do with these kids? You know, how are we going to serve them? As you said in the opening, you know, it's not right for any kid to be bored. And not only is it not right, you know, that if we're going to have a public education system that serves everybody, then everybody should get to come to school and learn something new every day, make progress over the course of the year. You know, teachers will also tell you that if you have a kid who's very precocious and is bored, that kid is likely to become a problem in your class, you know, because they're struggling and they're frustrated. So over the years, there were some studies, you know, started happening about how can we better serve these students, and some programs that would get started. Gifted and talented is usually referred to in the elementary school years, and the notion is, okay, what can we do to better serve these kids? Maybe, you know, a few times a week we will pull them out and have them do some activities with other gifted and talented kids in order to keep them challenged and engaged. But the issue is really bigger than that. I mean, schools have always had to struggle with this fundamental issue, which is that kids come to school at lots of different achievement levels for lots of different reasons. You look, I've got a kindergartner at home myself and a third grader, and you know, you walk into a kindergarten class and some of these are little tiny little babies still that look so tiny, and others are bigger, and you know, some are still learning their letters, and other kids are already reading Harry Potter. And you're the kindergarten teacher. How do you deal with that? And in the American classroom today, the way we typically deal with it is that the kids learn all together for most of the day, but throughout for part of the day, there's a small reading group, and all the kids who are already reading Harry Potter are together, and all the kids who are learning their letters are together, and we go forward like that. The reason I think gifted and talented got ideological was at some point, probably in, say, the 70s and 80s, when, as the Congressman said, there were big changes, there was desegregation and all of those controversies. There were places in America where gifted and talented programs became a place where white parents would sort of wall off opportunities for their own kids as a way to push back against the integration of schools. And that's an ugly part of that history, and one that I think we have to be honest about. And I think in part as a result of that, you started having arguments from people like Jeannie Oakes back in the late 80s saying, you know, any form of tracking, any form of ability grouping, any gifted and talented, any exam schools or advanced placement programs that are not open to everybody, any of that is inherently elitist and classist and racist. And there were some places that, as a result, started getting rid of those programs. The last piece I'll just make is that what happened, though, is that they didn't get rid of them everywhere. It tended to be in the higher poverty areas, in the cities, in places serving a lot of children of color and children coming from poverty that got rid of the gifted and talented programs. That didn't happen in the affluent suburbs. And as a result, today, if you are rich and you are white or you are Asian, you have a much better opportunity to have access to gifted and talented programs or exam schools or these other opportunities for challenge than if you're poor or a child of color. And that my argument that I'll make today is that the answer to this is not to snuff out all those opportunities, it's to open up those opportunities and expand them.
So we could say that the origins of gifted and talented had some inequity in it. And so Lauren, I would love for you to talk about what the national landscape looks like today for kids of color getting access into gifted and talented programs.
Yeah. First, I also want to bring into the discussion thinking about a lot of the arguments done for gifted education are around kind of the space race. People talk a lot about the space race and gifted education and making sure that we are advancing the nation, and that's done through making sure that our brightest kids are getting the best materials. And I want to bring into the discussion just kind of, I think what I'm really excited about is this idea of hidden figures in this new movie that's coming out that is around kind of thinking about NASA and space and this idea that there were black women who were behind the computers and they were human computers and they were doing incredible things when you still had this idea of segregation where those same black women who were calculating how to get to space would not even be able to they were still in segregated schools and segregated locations, and separate but equal was still the law of the land. So when you're thinking about the formation of gifted education, it does have history and roots in a lot of some of the principles that said that black people were inferior in intelligence. I think that's important to bring into the discussion. Another thing people say a lot is that gifted education, the one thing I've heard very many times, I got my master's at Tufts, and I took intellectual development coursework, and so a lot of it talked about, well, how do we support students and all students and making sure our gifted students are getting the best access. One thing I always heard about gifted education was that if you had a really strong athlete, you would want to make sure the athlete had that best training possible so that they could run even faster. Makes sense? So that's kind of the argument that they make for gifted education. One thing what we know about is Jesse Owens. The story is so stark to me. Jesse Owens is one of the best African American runners of all time. I think arguably he won the Olympics, and he has this title and carried it for a very long time. He comes home back into DC, and he goes to his own celebration party. He tries to walk into the front door, and they say, you can't walk into this door, you have to go through the service elevator. Please get that. Jesse Owens, who is the Olympian, who everybody is celebrating, had to go in through the service entrance to his own party. So this is a man who has demonstrated giftedness, yet still is not getting access in the same way. And so I think we see that here today, and I want to make sure that we ground that there are not disproportionate levels of black kids who are just less gifted across the world. That's not what it is, or that there are Latino kids who are less gifted. There is an issue, and this is a civil rights issue, where we have issues of access and equity for African American students. So the most recent civil rights data collection, you can see this in the First Look data collection that was released, the snapshot. The full data will be coming out this fall. The numbers are for white students. White students represent 49% of the general school population, and 57% of gifted and talented they are enrolled in gifted and talent programs. Sounds good. When you talk about Black and Latino students, they represent 42% of the public school landscape, but just 28% are enrolled in gifted and talented programs. So we have 49, 57, 42, and 28. And I want to make sure that we include English language learners into this discussion. They represent 11% in public schools, but only 3% of gifted and talented education. And so I think that when you think about looking at the history and thinking about how gifted education was started and where the current landscape is, that there are a lot of barriers for African American and Latino youth to get the high quality programming that they need and that has been scientifically proven among youth who are enrolled in gifted programs.
So Craig, let me ask you this, because you work on the ground with students. What are some of the barriers to this type of programming for students of color? Can you talk a little bit about what barriers the kids are experiencing?
Sure. So I think there are a couple, and I think they largely stem from choice and opportunity. Like, do students have, and I mentioned earlier, do students have access to these different opportunities? One of the things that we tried to do within KIPP was just to create that opportunity. So, we're, public charter schools. We started out 20 years ago as a pilot program for fifth graders. When we realized that working with fifth graders wouldn't be enough, we expanded that to middle schools. We realized that that wasn't enough of a runway. We went back and started at elementary schools and then high schools. And then over time, we really started saying, how do we do this better? Because even sending kids off to college is simply not enough. So getting access to was simply not enough as well. So it's like, what happens once you get access to? How do you actually get through college? And so over the years, we've had to continuously learn and evolve from others, partner with colleges and higher ed, and say, how do we figure out, how do we not just break down some of the barriers in terms of creating access, but how do we make sure that we're giving students the tools and equipping them with the knowledge and information that they're going to need to be able to sustain that access and ultimately get through? So a big part of it is the choice. Are the choices available? Do students have access? Do students have the information to get to it? But ultimately, whatever they're able to reach, are they able to get through it? And that's been a big part of our focus.
Is there any concern around how we're defining giftedness traditionally versus should we be modifying how we define a child that is gifted? And this is an open question. I encourage anyone to answer that. But how are we really defining what a gifted child is?
Sorry, excuse me. So in thinking about your remarks on sort of the origin of gifted and talented, specifically in the 20s, we know that the metrics used, specifically the intelligent tests used to assess who was gifted and talented, were steeped in deeply in specific cultural norms, in specific norms of what intelligence is. And we know that the folks who perhaps weren't Americans by birth, or the people who had different norms outside of the folks who were developing these tests, were obviously going to perhaps perform at lower rates than the students who the tests were, kept in mind for. So I think in historicizing that specific definition of gifted and talented, when we have to critically think about the ways in which we are assessing that even today, right? So in thinking about, in bringing up like English language learners and thinking about the ways in which we are challenging them but also assessing their potential, we can't necessarily put that simply based on, on creating tests around their ability to, or in facility with the English language, because, there's tons of social science research that documents that bilingual students are actually have, higher capacity for learning in certain ways. So I think it's important to be thinking critically about how we're defining gifted and talented. And I think that's an ongoing discussion as the landscape just continues to change.
This is a huge debate in the gifted field and has been for a long time. There's a great book out right now called The Excellence Gap by Jonathan Plucker at Johns Hopkins that gets into all of this. And I think you can easily get hung up on these debates because it's hard. I mean, everybody would define giftedness differently. Are we just talking about kids who are high achieving? Are we talking about gifted in one area or not another? I think when it comes to equity, one thing that we have found is that first of all, you got to be very careful of implicit bias, as Secretary Clinton talked about last night, that we've got recent research that shows that teachers, when they are involved in making recommendations for who should be in a program, that we do see bias coming through, intentional or not, that when white teachers make those recommendations, they're less likely to recommend children of color than when than the teachers are of color themselves. So that's an important finding. So we might decide then that maybe teacher recommendations shouldn't be a part of the process. New York City's been working hard for many years now to open up their gifted and talented programs, and they have tried to fiddle with the tests that they use or look at different policies. One thing that they've done is they still do have a test, and unfortunately, they set the test cut score such that you have to hit the same score regardless of where you live in New York City. Well, because of everything we know about achievement gaps, and it is mostly the white and Asian kids who are hitting that score. A different way to go would be to say, let's find 10% of kids at every elementary school in a given city, okay? And however you define that top 10%, whether it's a test or whatever metric you use, make it specific to those schools. Now, because most school systems are so highly segregated, that is by itself going to mean getting dramatically more kids of color and kids coming from low-income neighborhoods into those programs. And that, again, that's a fairly simple switch, but one that could have a huge impact. And we see in Washington, D.C. that Kai Henderson, big initiative to bring back gifted and talented programs all throughout the city. I mean, the when I look at the data, the major reason that we have such inequities is because there are a lot of high poverty schools out there that don't offer any of this to their kids. If we change that, we can make a lot of inroads.
I would just build on that point. I look back on my personal experience as early as elementary school, and I think a lot of young students realize early on how these labels are assigned to them. So they realize in the class they put in. I remember just thinking at this moment, elementary school, the class had a 3S or 3F. We've quickly realized that 3S was for 3 slow, 3F was 3 fast. Went off and to another school. When my mother took me out of that school, put me in another school, and it was 4SP, 4-1, 4-2, 4 for SP for special program, which was the gifted designation, 4-1, 4-2, 4-3, 4-4. After a while, students internalize that, and they are put on a track. And so this notion of how we select, like if you create these sort and select models of who has the talent, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so one of the things, for example, at Kitwick, I would argue we don't think of it as gifted and talent, but we have one designation, and you're a Kipster. I mean, you're a student in this school, and it's our responsibility to tap into your potential. It's our responsibility to help you identify and develop that passion, purpose, and plan for what you're going to become. So to identify students so young and only select them on a track actually misses out on a whole set of opportunities that other students will have or haven't yet realized, but ultimately, if cultivated, will develop.
You touched on an excellent point, and something also the Congressman raised, which is around environmental factors for students. And so we know that a lot of students of color have a lot of environmental impacts on them before they even enter the school system. So Hannah, I would love to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that the Congressman raised around zero tolerance policies and discipline issues. Also, family support systems, all those environmental factors, lack of resources for those schools. So, increasing access in some of those schools is important, but how do we ensure equity in those schools for those students? I would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I think in terms of contextualizing the achievement gap as well as the school to prison pipeline in the context of these variety of environmental factors is really important, because when we start to think about a kid's education, if we think as early on, I'm not sure if you guys can remember when you were kids and thinking about that gold star you maybe got on that test, or when you got reprimanded, those things especially are felt so acutely by children. And there's psychology research on this, there's education research on this. I'm specifically thinking about research done by Carol Dweck, who's a social psychologist, and she talks a lot about the growth mindset. So when we think about how we are labeling our children, right, how I was labeled as an Asian presenting woman, I think that it's important to think about, okay, like, how are kids thinking about themselves? And, as early on as preschool, kids are being disciplined, right? You're told that you're bad or that you did something bad, and kids will think that it's not just their actions, but it's about who they are, right? So in thinking about how children might be internalizing these notions, they're not gonna have a nuanced understanding of this one action that I did perhaps upset my teacher because XYZ, and therefore I will grow from this and I had to learn my behavior. They're gonna think that they're bad, And if we're looking at zero tolerance policies, the data suggests that it's not changing children's behavior, whether it's in middle school or in high school, that zero tolerance policies are reiterating this process of internalizing notions of good and bad, good children, bad children, smart children, and not smart, stupid. So I think these labels are really important, thinking about the policies that we're putting in place, specifically disciplinary policies that we're putting in place for students. And I think if we're trying to create access to education, a more equitable environment, this includes encouraging and praising students across the board for their achievements, right? And I think we should be very wary about the ways in which we are putting policies into place and using specific labels, because these things start young. And
And Hannah, can you talk a little bit about the Posse program and how the wraparound services that they provide are essential for
Right.
this population?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, so a little background on Posse. Posse is a leadership scholarship for high achieving and high potential high school students who might be overlooked by traditional college admissions processes. So as you can imagine, the most disadvantaged students, that intersects with class, that intersects with race, that intersects with a lot of other identity-based categories. So what's important about Posse is that by recognizing the inherent barriers in education that happen across these lines, the Posse admissions process is completely different. So you're nominated, you can self-nominate yourself, and I remember my very first interview, and it was in a room full of tons of other students, and we were assessed on our team building capacity. So that inherently is radical, right? We were thinking about team building when we're thinking about putting into place a model that assesses a student's ability and potential through their leadership, through their community interaction. That is one way, I think, to think critically about how we're assessing a student's success and potential for success. So further down the line, once you're selected for the Posse process, you form a cohort. So research documents that students, particularly students coming from communities of color or communities from immigrant backgrounds, tend to learn best when they are learning in a communal setting. So not stressing individual success, but stressing the success of a family, stressing the success of a community or a cohort or a posse. So throughout my senior year of high school, my posse and I trained and talked about ways in which our specific backgrounds, our specific lived experiences, our specific personal and family histories were assets to our education. How could we use that to ensure that we could not only succeed for ourselves in college, but to become agents of change on our campuses and after college? So oftentimes you find that I think why I love Posse is because it's not just about a full tuition scholarship. It's not just about giving resources. It's a holistic approach to our education, and I think one that pushes against this deficit model and instead takes what has traditionally been considered deficits to our education, i.e. my race, my immigrant background, or my class, and instead says, hey, that type of diversity that we're not seeing on our college campuses is an asset. That's what makes you and like what can help ensure your success. And I think that flip, that ideological switch, that change in labeling and reintegrating and re-narrating what is good and what is bad, what does success look like, and what can it look like. I think that's something that Posse has done particularly well for me, and I think if you look at the data, like shows that Posse students are graduating at much higher rates than in nationally, and also are achieving great things. So I think that it's really important to be contextualizing this holistic approach to education.
And Craig, do you want to jump in a little bit there, again, around KIPP? And you also provide a lot of the wraparound, follow the pipeline model as well for students. Do you want to talk a little bit about KIPP?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what Hannah shared, I think, definitely relates to how we approach students. Again, recognizing that part of the KIPP through college model really stems off this notion that we create high expectations for all students that we serve, and we create a college-going culture when students are with us in middle and high school. And that mindset, that shift that Hannah mentioned earlier, I think is exactly what puts students on this path, this notion of, well, what does it take to then get to college? It seems so far off. It seems like there's some things that I may not add up. I may not be able to afford it. And then we kind of demystify those and help students really understand, here's what the process is. Here's the difference between net price and sticker price. Here's how you apply. Here's how you articulate your story. Here's why college is a fit for you. And we began to go from just that high expectation to really then saying, how do we look at some of the data and help students to utilize data to really inform their practice, both students and counselors. So we've created this notion of college match, looking at some of the research coming out of the Hoxby and Avery and saying, like, well, what does it look like for students to find their fit? And so we looked at both head and heart factors, and we encouraged students to look at the data around enrollment rates, graduation rates, affordability, and then look at some of the heart factors. What may be a good fit for you? What do you want to major in? The size of school, how far away from home? And then really compile those things together and really decide then how do you build out a portfolio of options. So much about this notion of access is really about options. How do you create for students options? And having options empowers students, particularly when you can teach them how to make decisions around those options. So a big part of that investment is that data has been really phenomenal for us. But the research bears out that so many first generation and students not only undermatch, but under-apply to schools. They just don't apply to as many options. And so when we started this initiative 3 years ago, less than half of our students were even applying to 9 colleges. So you think about your traditional guidance back in the day, 3 reach, 3 core, 3 safety. Students weren't even applying to enough schools to give them viable choices. So less than half. And then 3 years later, 4 out of 5 of our students, with the guidance that we offered them through our match campaign, were actually applying to 9 or more colleges, just by giving them the information. And then similarly, we looked at this notion of what we call, applying to more selective schools. We call it likely plus target and reach, the same type of approach for generally speaking. 3 years ago, 11% of our students were applying to those highly selective schools, 6 or more likely plus target or reach options. Now we have 53%. So that's a 5x increase in 3 years just by giving students the data, giving students the tools, counseling students, building campaigns, investing in their parents. So that information, and goes to the core of what we believe in KIPP through college, knowledge is power. Giving students that knowledge, providing them with the data, inspiring them, changing the narrative, turning what are perceived deficits into strengths, focusing on character development, helping students understand that they have grit, they have perseverance, and then telling that, internalizing that, so that when they get to college, they have the tools to get through.
By the way, Craig's been very polite to the congressman, but I do hope our friends at CAP can maybe help the congressman understand that public charter schools are not draining money, that they are public schools themselves. Maybe they can take him to one of these KIPP schools to see the amazing work that's being done.
Love to host them.
That would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yes, okay.
Lauren, did you want to say something? I saw you wanted to.
Yeah. I just wanted to bring up two points in thinking that sometimes we have conversations in silos and don't necessarily always connect the dots on how. So kind of when you're thinking about equity in education, I think sometimes we talk about discipline and suspension and kind of having this disproportionate suspension level, and then you have the special education where you have the overrepresentation and the misidentification. And you also have gifted education where you have the underrepresentation. I think all of those are all part of the discussion of educational equity, and sometimes it's they'll have panels on discipline and panels on, but all of those are tied together in kind of in the same, some of the similar barriers that you're seeing for students in schools are all, you can tell that they kind of have similar outcomes. And so I think that is important to think about suspension, special education, and gifted education as civil rights issues, and making sure we're bringing those up. I think one thing I did want to think too is that when you're controlling for the actual coursework, I think it was mentioned that some of the schools don't have the coursework. I think that's true, but also a bigger issue is that a lot of schools do have gifted and talented programs or some type of pull-out program, and the minority representation there is starkly disproportionate. I think that is something that is really important. So I think increasing access as well, but I think we need to really think about screening. So I think we haven't mentioned, and we're probably getting this to this in the discussion, but thinking about there have been some kind of amplifying promising and proven practices. So like the two folks here are amazing examples of promising and proven practices to support students and unlock the hidden genius of every child. But I think too, when we have seen that when schools have shifted to models of universal screening for all students, they have found that it increases at one school in New Jersey, it increased to 150% in the representation of African American and Latino youth. Same students in the schools. But we have to think about, and I think we mentioned this a lot, teacher referral is one thing. A lot of it is parents. Some parents, and so there's a hidden curriculum in the fact that there are many parents who might not know when that test happens. And there are other parents who know when that test happens, and those kids have been going to, I taught a special education reading, and it was funny because it was interesting to me how the students I taught students SAT prepped, and so what we allowed all students to come to the program. There were some students who needed to learn how to read, and I taught students how to read, but there were also a large number of students who were coming because they wanted to read better and faster. And so they were actually accelerated and coming into the program and having their parents paid a large amount of money for us to teach them. They didn't need to know how to read. They needed to read in a way in which they felt like they could be accelerated and get to a different point. And so I think that was very interesting when you have different parents who are having access to different opportunities. And we noticed there that a lot of the students were getting an hour of my undivided attention on how to read the best way possible. And then the next hour, I would have another student who was in 6th grade and who could not read yet.
So Lauren, you're raising a good point about maybe changing the alternative models. Maybe there should be alternative models to gifted and talented. So I would love to have the panel kind of talk about the different models that are out there, and are there promising versions that will reduce inequity in specialized learning?
I mean, I feel like what a lot of us have been talking about is not so much the model, but the screen. How do you decide who gets in? And that's crucial. The universal screening is so important, meaning that everybody gets tested instead of having a policy where the parent has to sign the kid up for it. Obviously, that's going to, that if you want to build in inequities, make the parent, and only send the information in English and make it at an inconvenient time. And I mean, so kudos to systems that have done that. But you can't get around the fundamental issue, and whatever the model, the program, if you have a group of kids who where the thing they have in common is that they're the same age. They're all 8-year-olds, okay, but they are reading at dramatically different levels. They're doing math at dramatically different levels. As a teacher or as a school, you got to figure out, how am I going to serve all those kids well? What a lot of people are excited about now is the move towards personalized learning. So blended learning models, kids doing stuff online on the computers. And I think that is something that holds a lot of promise, because it is, in effect, tracking, but tracking for each individual kid. In other words, they are each on their own individual pathway, doing something at their own level of challenge, and then at times getting pulled together with small groups with the teacher to do small group instruction with other kids at their level. Now, again, I should avoid the word tracking. We all hate the word tracking, all right? So forget tracking. But it allows kids to be on their own pathway in a way that helps them make progress. And I think that may allow us, again, to get around some of these ideological arguments where we get nervous when we let kids go at different rates or on different paths. But there's no way of getting around that if you got kids at vastly different achievement levels.
Anybody want to respond?
Yeah. But then how do we get around, I think differentiated learning is incredibly important, and I think that every child does develop at their own pace, but when you have a teacher, and we've seen, and I think you mentioned the stat about white teachers not referring black students to gifted education programs, but I think that also trickles into the idea that when you're thinking about which books to read, when I've worked with youth, that I've seen white youth get chapter books, and I've seen black youth get regular books, and then the thing is, when I ask them, well, why do you have this chapter book and why do you have this regular book and you're in the same coursework, and I'm testing their reading and they're at the same reading level, it makes me nervous, because there's something going on there that deals with biases against African American students that somehow led the teacher to think, you take this picture book and you take this chapter book. And so I think sometimes that we have to remember, I think in the best, if I could dream of a school in which, every student went to school, I would love for a little African American child, and I've met some when I go to schools, to say to me that, like, I love school, this is what I'm doing, I'm feeling really challenged, your zone of proximal development is there, you've got a mentor, you've got these great things. But I hear that, unfortunately, I hear that a lot from white students, and I hear too many stories from black students about how they're being pushed out of school or how their teacher doesn't like them. I developed a program a couple years ago called Girls Rising Above Circumstances to Excel. And what my thought is if we change the way, if we put children with a 1.5 GPA or below in a program and tell them that's a gifted program, because I believe that they have incredible potential and that I want them to thrive, then I believe that even just coming in with that framework, instead of saying, the reason you're here is because you have a 1.5, you're at risk, would change things. And what I found was all of a sudden, students started coming to school more often, they started doing their homework, they started telling me things that they would go to the classroom and they would know that they had somebody on their side when the teacher said to them, why are you even here? And that I met three African American girls who said to me that their teacher had said to them, Why are you here? Are you even going to pay attention today? Did you do your homework? I'm sure you didn't do your homework. I have one, and there was the most extreme case to me was one teacher stopped giving an African American student homework because she figured she wouldn't do it anyway.
So I think, I mean, again, all excellent points on the panel, but I think you're raising something that we haven't touched on at all yet up here, which is the importance of a teacher and the teacher's role in the classroom. So I'd like to spend some time talking about, you know, what tools are needed for teachers to actually teach to the growing majority in American schools today. So what are some of the tools that are not being employed that should be employed, and what are some of the resources that are needed? Don't all jump at once. Don't all jump at once.
I mean, I think that the idea of cultural competency is important, and understanding that kids come to school not as blank slates. They come, what affects them before the school day and after the school day is just as important what happens during the school day. I think we think about a lot of lifting up, when we lift up the summer meal program over the summer, it's this idea that kids can't learn if they're hungry. But kids can't learn if, I just went, 2 weeks ago we held something at the White House talking about girls of color and trauma, and girls who are traumatized, who may go home to environments where they don't feel safe, have trouble paying attention in schools. And so I think that cultural competency is important. I think we've talked about the environment, and we know that African Americans are often in sites that have high rates of community violence or locations of poverty, and that affects students. And so it's not coming in with a bias and saying that that is somehow going to mean that they are going to perform less. It means that they might be performing a little bit differently, and they might need different assistance. And so I think cultural competency, but also cultural grounding. I think sometimes we don't see, I've been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture a couple times, and I want to go, I know, I've already been 3 times, and I'm telling you, I have been gushing for the past couple of weeks, so I was excited when it opened. But one thing that I saw when I went, so I went before, and when I went this weekend on opening weekend was the first time I went with people who were there. Like, there were other people who were watching the museum. And I found myself, I am a mixed methodologist, do a little bit of ethnography, so I'm not creepy, I promise. Watching children and seeing how they were interacting, right? Seeing how they were interacting with this new museum, because we don't talk about race a lot in schools. And so watching students was just so incredible to me, where they were reading the captions of something it starts in different levels, and it starts with slavery. And they were reading about what was going on. They were seeing there are little small infant shackles. And there were students who were there in a group of 7. And I watched, I was kind of, my heart was beating fast, because how do you process this? And I saw kids who said to me, they said, you know, it's kind of cool that we go to school now. Like, so much progress has happened. Like, this is kind of, they were just really trying to process this idea. But to them, there was I saw cultural pride. I saw a lot of pride at the National Museum. There was a lot of pain, but there was a lot of pride. And so this idea that when you have culturally grounded, when you're not actually infusing the culture of all students in your classroom, you're missing a critical opportunity for identity development, one that I really saw at the National Museum. So I think that is something that we need to
cultural competency for teachers, but also in the curriculum, I think you're raising.
Yeah.
Are there any other, I know you wanted to make a point, but are there any other points around what teachers need to better serve the children in their classrooms?
Yeah, I think building off of that point, I mean, it's such a broad, when we say cultural competency, it's such a broad but critical piece. Because at the end of the day, you know, we're talking about educating the whole child. And so this piece about gifted and talented, if you think about cultural competency, how do you meet students where they are? How do you value their communities? How do you value their parents as part of the solution, right? How do you engage parents constructively, not be threatened by or believe or have inherent biases that the parent isn't invested in the child? If you connect in that way, if you have empathy, like one of the themes of last night's debate we referenced earlier was this notion of like community, right? How do you build community within schools? How do teachers feel that they're part of that community and engage the whole community? Become familiar with the neighborhood that they work in. Become familiar with the neighborhood that the students have come from. Think about how the curriculum and how students access and connect with that curriculum. Do they see themselves in it? If they see themselves, do they see themselves and feel a sense of pride? do the experiences and exposure and the field trips all connect in a way that through that child's eyes and lens, they feel the connectedness? Do they develop and cultivate a sense of purpose as a result of the learning? Like all of those things are connected to what a child's experience is in the classroom, and then ultimately connects to this notion of, am I worthy? Am I gifted? What are my, not am I talented, but what are my talents? And then from a broader perspective, when we talk about access to these unique opportunities, including college, how do we think about access to them more holistically so that the criteria isn't just the sort of traditional measures that are really separating, and it's, again, that sort and select model, but are more holistic, similar to what Hannah described about how she was like thinking about team building. Oh, I can be part of a team. I can build, like just the broadening of that discussion, that perspective. So when I think of cultural competency, that's that kind of broadening of it that I think connects with students in a very powerful way.
Oh, go ahead. Sure.
I was going to say, like, this framework of cultural competency and community, I think, has been really effective in both my experiences as a student, but also my experiences as a teacher, as an educator. I think specifically to my teaching experience with an education nonprofit in the Bay Area called Next Generation Scholars. And before I met any of my students, here is a nonprofit that's located in the community. And also, I can tell you, the woman who runs it, the ED, she knows every single parent. She knows what's going on in the home, both the positive things and perhaps the more negative things, but all that context grounded how she was interacting with her students, and not in a way that would judge them or that would stereotype them, but in a way that could contextualize why a student might be late, why a student might be tired, why a student might not be engaging in the ways that we expected them to for that particular day. And I think having a case review of all of the students who were in my classroom, knowing who was there, really allowed me to interact with them on a real level in a way that I knew that, you know, I had sort of a grounding and competency to know how, you know, the material that I was presenting in my classes, how this might affect them, and the ways in which, like, I was approaching my pedagogy, what sort of tools would be most effective. So I think when we're thinking about cultural competency, it's not just about a 4-hour workshop on our differences and how that can be embraced, which I think is important, right? I think it's important for our educators to be having those discussions and those dialogues, but I think it's also knowing the community that you're working with, knowing where your students are coming from, and also having them embrace that both in the materials that you're using and also in your interactions with them. So I think, yeah, thank you.
And Mike, I know you wanted to make a
Well,
point.
I'm going to make a policy wonky point, which is that doesn't feel right after those powerful statements. But we are at a policy shop, so
Okay.
let's acknowledge that we have been working for the last 15 or 20 years under accountability systems that have signaled to schools that high achievers are not their priority. And the reason that was under No Child Left Behind. Of course, the way the system worked was it was about getting kids to this very low level called proficiency in reading and math. And if kids were already above that level, you know, they didn't really count. They were going to pass that test regardless. We now have a great opportunity under the new federal law, last year's Christmas gift, as President Obama called it, ESSA, for states to move away from that model. We did a study recently, though, looking at this. I know CAP has done this as well. And most states still have not moved away from that model. You know, most states still don't make most of their accountability system focused on progress over time. They're still very much focused on the percentage of kids who are hitting those proficiency marks. And even though, thanks to the Common Core and tougher tests, we've raised the bar on what it means to be proficient or college or career ready, that's still not a high enough bar for our highest achieving kids. And so what we need is a system that says to schools, look, if you want to be an A school under this new system, you've got to make sure that all kids make progress over the course of the year, both the kids who start 2 grade levels behind and the kids who start 2 grade levels ahead. And I think that, from a policy perspective, is going to unleash all kinds of creative solutions on the ground about how to better serve high-achieving kids, and especially high-achieving kids of color, who are who are disproportionately going to be in high-poverty schools, the schools that are most concerned about getting on the bad schools list and having interventions. We've got to tell those schools, yes, of course your low-performing kids are a priority, but so are your high-performing kids that they count too.
And I think one actual tangible thing is that states have to create state equity plans. So I think it's important for everyone to ask what the state equity plan is and how they are, that you're going to have data and increased transparency and accountability. And I think that it is up to all of us in this room and all of us generally to make sure that we are pushing for that type of level of equity. But I do think state equity plans and looking at accountability under ESSA have changed.
So I think we're going to open it up to questions, but what I summarized just in listening to all of you right now is we have a lot of work to do. So with that, I'm going to open it up for a few questions. I think we have time for maybe two. The woman in the front right here.
Hi, Louanne McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English, and many of our members are very sensitive to assigning diverse literature, but will face the facts that the majority of our teachers are white. And I know there's a huge issue in recruiting and retaining teachers of color. So how do we do this in an environment, political environment, that excoriates and denigrates teachers all the time?
Well, I think, I think it's a two-part to that. I think one part, when I think about like recruiting teachers of color, I think it goes back to this notion of, for me, two parts. One is being gifted and talented teachers, seeing in teachers different assets and attributes, and being willing to step outside the box in terms of how you go about recruiting teachers. I do think in this day and age, like, you really have to be intentional about how you recruit, how you build a pipeline. Hannah and I discovered just in connecting around this panel, we both went through a similar program called the Institute for Recruitment of Teachers. And that was a program that was really geared towards, exposing us to, graduate school and other things, and really understanding some of the principles that we talked about in terms of reaching students. I think the other piece is that, within our schools, we have to just be more open and willing to this notion of, diversifying the composition of faculty as much as we are talking about it of our students. And I think sometimes there are biases that exist there. And I think that there's also this notion and challenge of the accountability piece that for some may turn them off. But at the same time, we do have to be rigorous about setting standards that are really geared towards making sure we're doing right by kids.
Great, thank you. One other question? Lady in the back right here.
Good morning. I am Alina Bell, principal of Peabody and Watkins with Capitol Hill Cluster Schools with DCPS. And I have to acknowledge some staff members I have here, as well as parents and community, because we're tackling this work as a community. And so my question is, as we recently released our PARC data scores, our community noticed huge disparities between our African American students and their white peers. And as a community, we're trying to figure out what our next steps are. So when you speak in terms of gifted and talented, I happen to believe that all students that come into my building are gifted and talented, and that is the job and role of the responsibility of our teachers to continue to grow and develop that talent. We have a challenge with PARC and what that means, what that data means, and how it's perceived with our students of color. So my question is, what are your, from a policy standpoint and as a practitioner with KIPP, what are your thoughts on standardized tests and sometimes perpetuating the narrative of the deficits that exist with our students of color in comparison to their colleagues with regard to the achievement gap, and what are high leverage things that teachers and staff can do in order to close that gap?
So I'll touch on it just very briefly. I would say, one, I think tests are a tool, and things should be seen and perceived as a tool. And I think, especially as a teaching tool, I think it could help teachers understand where there are gaps and where they should adjust their approaches to reaching students and to improve outcomes. But I think if there's an over-reliance on those outcomes, meaning the test alone, then I think we aren't really doing right by kids in total. So I would just say, we think of it as a tool, think of it as a teaching practice, use it to help guide your practice and outcomes, but not to place an over-reliance on it.
I would also say communicate to your students that it is a tool, right? That all that a standardized test can really assess is how well you can take that test. And I think that shift for students is really important because it has to consider the preparation that they have and that they have access to in taking this test. And I think, again, in sort of broadening your, if students are only thinking about, and I can attest to like my peers who, like in public school, and also the students that I've worked with who've gone through public school systems, both in California, in Northern and Southern California, they really saw this test as like the determinant of their intelligence, of their success, of, you know, the reach of their dreams. And I think like that can be really faulty, and just like reshifting and re-narrativizing what a test means as a tool, I think is really important in communicating that to students.
So I just want to thank all of the panelists up here. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Thank you, and I want to thank you all for coming as well. CAP put out a column today highlighting 5 different ways that we can ensure kids of color are getting the tools that they need to be successful, so I encourage you to pick that up on your way out. But I think the bottom line here is that we have some work to do. We need to shift the model, and we need to ensure that all kids are actually getting the tools they need to be successful. So thank you. Have a nice day.